Thank you so much for coming out, and thank you for all the incredible support that you've given us in the now 18 months that we've all been going through this. And I know that all of us are zoomed out, and so it's wonderful to be able to see you all in person, and we are really thrilled to be able to be back and to do this again and again and again. I hope that you'll check out our lineup of events. We have our lineup on the entryway when you come in. We have a limited number of events this year because we're trying to, ease our way through the COVID experience as the rest of the campus. In fact, speaking of which, thank you for doing what I'm not. As you know, SMU has a mask mandate right now, so you get an exemption if you're at the mic. That's basically the rule. Actually, it's not the rule. We just made that up. But, so thank you for keeping your mask on for that. We really appreciate it. We have a whole wonderful series of events coming up. We also are thankfully able to go forward and plan our next couple of trips for the center. We actually are taking a full group to the Pearl Harbor commemoration in December. That trip is all full up, but our trip for next May, looking at Cold War and end of World War II battle sites and important moments in Central Europe is just up and running now. So if you're interested, please check that out. We're going to be going to the Czech Republic and to Germany. We're going to do Leipzig and Berlin and really talk about what really happened at the end of the Cold War. So that's going to be really exciting. So I am particularly pleased to be able to introduce our introducer tonight because Brian Franklin has a new role at the center. He is now Director of Programming. I just told you that. And he is the one who's going to be doing all of the hosting duties and has really played a leading role in making sure that we have the incredible lineup that we have. So without further ado, Dr. Franklin.
The best kind of jobs are the jobs that you're told to do, right, at last minute. No, I'm really thrilled to do this. We've gotten to talk about this, and I really enjoy being here with you all, and I really enjoy bringing people together. And so getting to put a lineup together of people I know, people I don't know, interesting looking things that I think you might want to be here for has been a real pleasure. So I won't keep you long. I'm just here mainly tonight to introduce Dr. McBride. So I met Spencer McBride about 10 years ago. I was actually looking this up earlier this afternoon when we both arrived at a conference, the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, known as SHEAR for those in the know. We both met about 10 years ago. We were both grad students. We were both working on religion in early America. We both came from state schools. I was at Texas A&M. He was at LSU. And we just hit it off immediately, struck up a friendship, and been friends ever since. And since then, I've learned a lot from Dr. McBride, and I've really looked up to his accomplishments. I'm just going to give you a couple of them here to introduce him. He is Associate Managing Historian of the Joseph Smith Papers, a project based in Salt Lake City. He and his team are responsible for producing the comprehensive record, both in print and online, of all the writings of Joseph Smith and of those directly associated with him. This includes journals, teachings, letters, editorials, meeting notes, anything you can imagine he might have written or the people right around him wrote, that's what they're working on. It's an amazing online resource if you have a chance and you're interested to go check out. He is also author or editor of 3 books with a 4th on the way. These include his really fabulous first book, Pulpit and Nation, Clergymen and the Politics of Revolutionary America, and his most recent book, which we're here to hear about tonight, Joseph Smith for President, The Prophet, the Assassins, and the Fight for American Religious Freedom. I'll say it once and I'll say it again at the end. These are for sale outside. I really encourage you to go and get it. You're going to want to after you hear this tonight. So please welcome with me Dr. Spencer McBride.
Well, it's fitting to be here tonight competing against the Dallas Cowboys for attendance. So I'm thankful for the Center of Presidential History, for Jeffrey Engel, for Brian Franklin, and for Rana Spitz, and all that they did to bring me out here. I can't say enough good things about the Center for Presidential History and what it does for scholarship, for public history. And it's great to be a part of that. And it feels very fitting for me because it was I think it was 2017. 2020 has really thrown off my mental math of how long ago something was. I think it was in 2017. I'd finished the first book, and I was kind of toying with what my next book would be. And I was thinking about a book about Joseph Smith's kind of long-shot presidential campaign. And of course, I mentioned this to my colleagues at the Joseph Smith papers, and of course, they're like, oh, that sounds like a great book. But I was left with the question, would anyone other than my colleagues actually want to read this book? And it's hard to know. And Brian, I was down here for some other, looking at some old documents that were in private possession, and Brian offered to host an informal brown bag, and I could kind of test the waters with different faculty and students. I got a lot of positive response, and also some really good suggestions, and so I went full steam ahead. And so it feels good to be here now 4 years later with the book finished. Now, this may seem odd that in a talk about Joseph Smith and politics, that I start by invoking Charles Dickens. But I promise you, if you hang with me here, it's going to make sense. You see, Charles Dickens is one of my favorite authors, and he's written what I believe is the best opening line for a novel ever. Now, you can dispute this, but I'm standing with this opinion. And it comes in A Christmas Carol. Show of hands, how many have read A Christmas Carol? Excellent. And now my family read it every year, every Christmas time. And so I have parts of it even memorized. And the first line of that book starts, Marley was dead to begin with. And then Charles Dickens spends 3 long paragraphs telling you just how dead Jacob Marley was, all to come back in the 4th paragraph to this line. This must be distinctly understood if anything wonderful is to come from the story I'm about to relate. You see, if we did not know that Jacob Marley was dead, there's nothing remarkable about him appearing to Ebenezer Scrooge in his bedchamber, save the lateness of the hour. We would think it was just 2 business partners discussing things. But when you know that Jacob Marley was, in fact, as dead as a doornail, it makes the story matter. And so I ask myself, when I write history, or when I speak about history, what must be distinctly understood for something wonderful to come from the story I'm about to relate? In this case, what must be distinctly understood about the context of Joseph Smith's presidential campaign? This is what I think it is. The Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual states prior to the Civil War and the passage of the 14th Amendment. I'll say that again. Before the 14th Amendment, which came after the American Civil War, the Bill of Rights was not applied by the federal government to the individual states. Now, this used to be a commonly known fact of American civic education. And whether we have forgotten it on purpose, or maybe it's a symptom of our seemingly ever worsening case of historical amnesia, it's not as well known. Now, the Bill of Rights had been adopted with the philosophy of protecting the rights of the American people from infringement by the federal government. But the Supreme Court could not enforce those 10 amendments on the individual states. A big part of this was the reigning constitutional interpretation of the day, the states' rights doctrines. But it was more than just constitutional interpretation. The Supreme Court had set this precedent in 2 different decisions. In 1833, in the case Buren v. Baltimore, it ruled explicitly that the Bill of Rights cannot be enforced by the Supreme Court or the federal government on the individual states. And then in 1845, in the case Bernard v. Promoli, it got even more specific. And it said that the freedom of religion clause in the First Amendment could not be enforced by the federal government on the individual states. The Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual states before the Civil War. Okay, if you stay with me, it's all going to be, it's just like Marley being dead, right? It's all going to come together. This is the reason Joseph Smith gets involved in politics, to change this. Now, some of you might know a lot about Joseph Smith, who's best known as the founder of Mormonism, and maybe some don't. So, real brief, in a nutshell, this is Joseph Smith's, background. When he was a teenager, his family moved from New England to Western New York, part of the great Yankee invasion of Western New York, at a time when the country was going through what's known as the Second Great Awakening. A series of revivals were sweeping the nation, and they were particularly strong and concentrated in Western New York, where young Joseph Smith had gone to live with his family. And he was left to wonder about the state of his soul. And he wanted Christian salvation, but he wondered, which of all these churches do I join? And he wanted to be a Methodist, but he wasn't sure. And so he goes into the woods near his home to ask God what to do. And according to his history, as he tells it, he has a vision of deity where he is instructed to join none of the churches, and is told that the primitive Christian church, primitive Christianity, would be revealed to him at a later date. Again, according to his history, this vision of deity is followed by several angelic visitations, where he is shown an ancient record that is believed to be scriptural, written on gold plates, that he says he translates by the gift and power of God. And in 1830, he publishes the Book of Mormon, a translation of that record, and it's in that same year that he founds a church that becomes known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, this isn't presented as just any other Christian denomination. Those who join this church believe that it is the primitive Christian church restored to the earth. And it turns out that there are a lot of people that had the same questions Joseph Smith had. They were dissatisfied with the religious status quo. They were seeking what they called primitive Christianity. And within a few years, thousands of men and women had converted and flocked to become members of this church. Another thing that set this church off from many other Christian denominations is that they tended, once you converted, to gather, to relocate, and to live with other Latter-day Saints. And this is where the source of many of the Mormons' problems begin, because they're an outside religion, and gathering causes consternation among their non-Mormon neighbors. They're a religious minority group, but they live in close-knit societies. They vote together. They do business dealings with each other. They were an economic and political threat in the eyes of many of their neighbors. And this led to persecution, tars and featherings, mob violence. And this drove the Mormons from New York to Ohio and eventually to Missouri, where they planned to stay forever. But things got even worse in Missouri. And in 1838, there's what's known as the Mormon War in Missouri. And it begins over a frustrated politician who wanted to keep the Mormons from voting. He had courted that Mormon bloc vote. He wanted them to vote for him. And when they showed up in large numbers to the polls in the little town of Gallatin, Missouri, someone said a group of men tried to block their voting. And one man said, and these are his words, that Mormons had, quote, no more right to vote than Negroes. A fight breaks out. The Mormons win the fight, but the fighting doesn't stop. And it escalates into full-blown war between the mob and the Mormons. The governor calls the militia out, but many in the militia sympathize with the mob and join forces with the mob. They kill Mormon men. They burn Mormon homes, steal Mormon property, rape Mormon women. And when the Mormons appeal to the governor of the state, Lilburn W. Boggs, they are not met with help, but rather an infamous executive order in which the governor declares, the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary to preserve the peace. Now, this might sound very different than the narrative we're traditionally taught about American religious freedom. We are so often taught that with the Revolution, with the Constitution, universal religious freedom was established. But the reality is, it established religious freedom for a large group of Protestants, but not in every state. Some states continued to have religious establishments well into the 1800s. Connecticut got rid of theirs in 1813, Massachusetts in 1833. Remember that whole Bill of Rights doesn't apply to the individual states? This is one instance where it comes into play. And so the Mormons were forced to flee Missouri in the dead of winter under threat of state-sanctioned extermination. And they cross the Mississippi River and are taken in by very kind residents of Quincy, Illinois. And there on the banks of the Mississippi River in Illinois, they begin to rebuild their lives as refugees. And this is where Joseph Smith's political story begins. Because I don't think Joseph Smith was naturally a political person. Now, granted, I don't think there's a politician then or now that would admit that they were in it for the power. I think every politician or political candidate assures constituents and would-be voters that, trust me, I'm doing this only because the people are calling me to it. I don't want power. And, most of them probably do. But I think Joseph Smith, it was out of desperation. And so once his people are starting to rebuild their lives in 1839, he and some of his fellow church leaders take a trip to Washington, D.C., to make their case to the president and to Congress. Now, these are the days when you could knock on the White House door to seek an audience with the president. I don't even think you could make it to the White House door today. But with the representative in Illinois, they go to the White House door, they knock on it, they are ushered in, and Van Buren was known for almost daily receptions he held in the parlor outside his office every afternoon. And you could jockey for FaceTime with the president to make your case on whatever issue was on your mind. And that's exactly what Joseph Smith and his colleagues do. There's several, and they write this down, several comments from, as they're waiting their turn to talk to President Van Buren about his weight. Apparently the stress of the office had led to a lot of weight gain, and he was going to the tailor. He was kind of embarrassed to admit every few weeks to have his clothes taken out. And Joseph Smith and them, they write this down. That's how we know that. And then finally they get their audience with the president, and they hand him a letter of recommendation from a political leader in Illinois explaining the case. And after reading the letter, Van Buren curtly says, "What can I do? I can do nothing for you. If I do anything, I will come in contact with the state of Missouri. So essentially, if I speak out for you, I will lose the state of Missouri in next year's election." And Van Buren knew that re-election was going to be tough. And Missouri was one of the only states that he could squarely count in his column. And so I don't know if there's any evidence of bigotry or religious prejudice for Martin Van Buren. But it's political calculus that leads him to decline to help the Mormons. And so Joseph Smith leaves the White House dejected. His idealism in the American political system has been cracked a bit. It's still intact, but it's cracked, tarnished. But he still has hope because they were going to Congress. What they wanted from Van Buren was for him to speak out in favor of their cause in his message to Congress, or what we call today the State of the Union Address. And so they go to Congress, and they write a memorial, 27 handwritten pages that explains the whole affair in Missouri, and they attach to it hundreds of sworn affidavits itemizing all Mormon property that was lost in Missouri. And they bring it to Congress, and the Senate holds a special hearing of its Judiciary Committee, not to determine whether or not to give the millions of dollars that the Mormons were requesting in reparations, but whether or not the federal government had any jurisdiction in the case. And there's 3 days of hearings. And at the end, the committee decides unanimously that the federal government cannot intervene. It cannot ensure religious freedom for the Mormons. It cannot restore their property, that the Mormons need to go to the state of Missouri for redress. And the Mormons, of course, are astounded by this. We went to the state of Missouri, and the governor issued an extermination order against us. You expect us to go back. And so Joseph Smith leaves Washington, D.C. very frustrated. And I think this is indicative of what was very common then, and maybe even a little bit now. The farther removed geographically you are from the seat of government, it's easy to idealize what happens in the halls of government, how Congress works, how political laws are made. And the closer you are, you see how much is done in back rooms, how much is done in bars and taverns and restaurants. And so for Joseph Smith, it was very eye-opening in a very disconcerting way. So he goes back to Nauvoo, which is the city that they're constructing on the banks of the Mississippi River, and he's determined that we need to protect ourselves. Illinois has been very kind to us so far, but that could change. And so they design a city. I call it in my book a city-state on the hill. And it's literally on a hill. And it's designed to protect the Mormons' rights. And they put together in a city charter, perhaps it's an unprecedented aggregation of city powers. The city council is given tremendous power to issue writs of habeas corpus that protect Joseph Smith and others from arrest by those coming from outside. The mayor's court, and Joseph Smith would eventually be mayor, is given tremendous power in deciding criminal and civil cases. And the charter gives the Latter-day Saints the chance to create a community militia as part of the state militia, but that they have more control over. And eventually they will have a militia of 2,500 men at a time when the standing army of the United States was 8,000 men. That's how they use this. And you may say, why would the Illinois State Assembly go for such a city charter? Why would they pass it? And it comes back to politics. Doesn't it always seem to come back to politics? At this time, in the 1840s, Illinois was a divided state. The Democrats and the Whigs were almost evenly divided, and the Mormons who voted together, they were a minority, but they would be playing kingmakers. Whichever party they decided to vote for would win. And so both parties are eager to secure this vote, to the point that this city charter breezes through the assembly, and the Mormons are congratulated in particular by two up-and-coming politicians. One, a young Whig lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, comes up and gives them his hearty approval of their charter. You guys have probably heard of him. And also someone who would become famous, among other things, for debating Lincoln, a young Stephen A. Douglas, similarly as a Democrat, gives his approval of the city charter. And so the hope is that this can protect the Latter-day Saints from any further persecution. And it seems to work at first. And the Mormons have several years where they are prospering. And they build up the city of Nauvoo. You can see the map of the proposed city blocks, this giant temple, which would be, as far as I can tell, the largest building along the Mississippi River at this time. And at its height, within a few years, it is the largest city in Illinois, even larger than Chicago. But then things start to go south. And it's difficult to pinpoint exactly when, but many people pinpoint 1843, because what happens, block voting can work if you're consistent and predictable. It's when you cease to be consistent and predictable as a block vote that people aren't going to tolerate you as a minority voting bloc. And in 1843, Joseph Smith had essentially promised someone running for Congress that the Mormons would vote for him. And a day before the election, his brother Hiram claimed that he had a revelation that they should vote for the other candidate. And so Joseph Smith keeps his word, and he votes for the candidate he promised, along with 6 other residents of Nauvoo. Thousands of others vote for the other guy. He wins the election. And from this moment on, a large portion of the county and the state became determined to drive the Mormons out. They just were waiting for the right opportunity. Even a new political party arises called the Anti-Mormon Party, and they are a one-issue party, and that's getting the Mormons out of Illinois. So by 1843, it looks like things that happened in Missouri are going to happen again in Illinois. And Joseph Smith says, we need help. And so once again, they try the federal government. The first thing they do is in November 1843, Joseph Smith writes 5 letters to the 5 men expected to run for president. The guy who wins, you might notice, James K. Polk, wasn't even on anyone's radar at this point, so he's not one of them. Spoiler alert if you didn't know that that's how this ends. So Martin Van Buren, Richard Mentor Johnson, Lewis Cass, John C. Calhoun, and the person who wanted to be president more than anyone else in American history, Henry Clay. And he writes them all the same letter that essentially asks, quote, what will be your rule of action relative to us as a people should fortune favor your ascension to the chief magistracy? So essentially, if we vote for you, what will you do to make sure that we are protected, that our rights are protected? Van Buren and Johnson never write back. Lewis Cass and John C. Calhoun give the same answer, essentially, that they sympathize with the Mormons, that they feel that they should have equal rights, but that states' rights prevents the federal government from ensuring that they do. Essentially saying, yeah, we feel bad for you, but the federal government won't get involved and shouldn't get involved. And this really irks Joseph Smith, and he writes an open letter to John C. Calhoun in which he declares that Congress, with the president as its executor, should be as almighty in its sphere as Jehovah is in his. And he declares to the Nauvoo City Council, the states' rights doctrines are what feed mobs. They are a stink offering in the nose of the Almighty. So how did Joseph Smith feel about the states' rights doctrine? I mean, he kind of left it out on the table there. But, and this is just a personal opinion, he really didn't like what Cass and Calhoun said. But I think he really detested what Henry Clay wrote, because Henry Clay played the ultimate politician. He wrote back that he sympathized with the Latter-day Saints. He felt bad for them. But he didn't want to make any promises, because if he made any promises on the campaign trail, he might have to actually keep them. That's not his exact wording, but that's the gist of what he said. And so it's just a sense that, you know, Cass and Calhoun make a principled stand. Joseph Smith didn't like it, but at least there was a principle in there. Where Henry Clay was essentially, you know, it was all about politics. And Joseph Smith writes a really harsh, open letter to Henry Clay as well in response. And so the Mormons are in a conundrum. They are a minority group in Illinois, but they can determine who wins Illinois' electoral votes. And in a very close race, they may be more than just kingmakers in Illinois. They could become kingmakers nationally. And so they determine on a very cold January morning in 1844 that they are going to vote for the candidate of neither major party. That they would have an independent candidate for president, and that candidate would be Joseph Smith, and that the church would do everything in its power to see him elected. Joseph Smith accepts their nomination, and within 3 weeks has drafted his platform in the form of a pamphlet called General Smith's Views on the Powers and Policy of the United States Government, in which he laments the decline of the United States. Now, this isn't new. For decades and decades, in our own time, politicians have lamented the decline of their country. But if you ever try to ask them when the decline started, they're hard-pressed to tell you. Well, Joseph Smith goes through the first 8 presidents, and he can pinpoint the exact date when the United States began to decline, and it is the inauguration of Martin Van Buren. What's baffling to me as a historian, I've yet to figure this out, is Jackson, they had written the Jackson administration for help too earlier with some of the persecutions, and they'd given the same answer. But for some reason, Jackson was great, like the other presidents, but not Van Buren. Nope, not at all. One issue had driven Joseph Smith to run for president: religious freedom. But Joseph Smith was not a one-issue candidate. He put forward a robust, progressive, idealistic, in some places even naive platform of his vision for what the country could be. And he starts with race and slavery. In fact, in the very first paragraph of his pamphlet, this is what he writes. My cogitations, like Daniel's, have for a long time troubled me. When I viewed the condition of men throughout the world, and most especially in this boasted realm, where the Declaration of Independence holds these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But he continues. But at the same time, some 2 or 3 million of people are held as slaves for life, because the spirit in them is covered with darker skin than ours. Joseph Smith puts forth a novel, pragmatic, even if doomed, position on how to end slavery. It needed to be ended by 1850, and they would do it by purchasing the freedom of every enslaved man, woman, and child. The federal government would purchase their freedom from the proceeds of the sales of Western lands. Paid manumission wasn't new. The Quakers, for instance, had been doing this for years. But they would purchase one enslaved person's freedom at a time, maybe a family at most. What Joseph Smith was proposing was the end of slavery by the federal government paying for the freedom of every enslaved man, woman, and child. Ideologically, it was problematic, right? Because abolitionists claimed these men, women, and children should not be held as property because a person cannot be property. Paying for their freedom acknowledges that they are property, even if by doing so you are ensuring that they will never be treated as property again. So Joseph Smith took a compromise at one ideological level for a greater ideological good. He was very pragmatic in this approach. He also called for criminal justice reform, and this was a time when penitentiaries were all the rage. They were just burgeoning in the country, and he saw something wrong with the way that criminals were treated in the United States, that we were, in essence, not reforming men, and in fewer instances, women, who were convicted of crimes, but we were instead, by the way we imprison them and punish them, creating a permanent criminal class. And so he wrote, rigor and seclusion will never do as much to reform the propensities of man as reason and friendship. Let penitentiaries be turned into seminaries of learning, or that's the 18th century way of saying build schools, not prisons, where intelligence, like the angels of heaven, would banish such fragments of barbarism. Criminal justice reform was a major plank in Joseph Smith's platform. So was territorial expansion. And if there was one issue that was at the front of Americans' minds in the election of 1844, it has to do with where we are right now, the annexation of Texas. Because the annexation of Texas would, in essence, expand slavery and, as many feared, preserve the life of the institution. Joseph Smith calls for the abolition of slavery and the annexation of Texas. I imagine that if you get rid of slavery, then the annexation of Texas is not a hot-button issue. He also calls for the United States to claim by right all of the Oregon country, which was disputed between the British and the Americans. He also calls for a national bank. Now, if the territorial expansion and the annexation of Texas was the hot-button issue of 1844, the national bank had been the hot-button issue for almost every presidential election previous. There had been 2 banks of the United States, and Joseph Smith called for a third because since the 1830s, the United States economy was going through an almost predictable cycle of extreme booms and devastating busts. And he said, we need a national bank to stabilize the economy. But this one would be different. Private investors would not get rich off the national bank. The men who ran and operated the bank would be paid a per diem of $2 a day. Somehow in Joseph Smith's mind, that's what a farmer made on average. So he also proposes that Congress's pay gets cut to $2 a day. That's kind of his standard, like, that's the honorable wage. So we give them, no one's going to get rich off the national bank. The national bank will serve the public by stabilizing the economy. But at the heart of Joseph Smith's campaign, he wasn't a one-issue candidate, but there was one issue that drove him, and that was religious freedom, and it meant constitutional reform. The federal government needed to be empowered to protect minorities when the states failed to do so. He wasn't trying to get rid of states' rights altogether, but when a state failed to protect minorities, or even worse, when the state was the persecutor of minorities, the federal government needed to be empowered to step in and protect them. And these were Joseph Smith's views of the powers and policy of the United States government. He prints thousands of copies, and he sends them to the president, to his cabinet, to every member of Congress, to every Supreme Court justice. And then he takes advantage of something that he had that other third-party or long-shot candidates didn't. One advantage that Joseph Smith had over any others who might try to enter the race without the political machinery of the Whigs and the Democrats. This is a cliffhanger, right? I should actually tell you what that is. What Joseph Smith had that the others didn't was an experienced corps of missionaries who knew how to travel the country and preach the gospel. But this time they were enlisted to preach politics and to canvass the country with this campaign platform, this pamphlet, as a tract of sorts. Hundreds, somewhere between 400 and 600 missionaries then leave Nauvoo, Illinois, and canvass the entire country. And their experiences are fascinating. One of my favorite stories happens in Boston, where a young Brigham Young is leading a nominating convention, and I don't want to say this describes Boston today in case there's any Bostonians here, but I think it epitomizes what was happening in Boston in the 1800s. There are hecklers in the crowd, and it gets so bad that the police are called. And then fighting breaks out, but not between the hecklers and the Mormons. The hecklers start brawling with the police. And the whole convention has to be canceled and rescheduled for the next day. In New York City, the missionaries establish a campaign newspaper. This way, the campaign news and Joseph Smith's positions can be picked up by other newspapers throughout America. And it's right there on Printers Row. If any of you are familiar with Lower Manhattan, where Pace University is today, that was where all the major newspapers were printed. And eventually a man named Sam Brannan, he's a Mormon convert, and he starts running the printing press. Now, does that name sound familiar to any of you? Because Sam Brannan, and this is like the ultimate esoteric political fact I'm going to give you, but you're going to be such a hit at your next dinner party when you drop this knowledge. Sam Brannan has a printing press. He's printing Joseph Smith's campaign newspaper. Eventually, a few years later, he's going to take that printing press on a ship around Cape Horn to San Francisco. And in 1849, he's going to print the first published news of the discovery of gold in California. And it's on the same printing press by the same printer who published Joseph Smith, who was a campaign missionary. Okay, now you guys are going to go like, when's my next dinner party so I can impress my fellow party attendees with that fact. The reception in the South was fascinating. And one of my favorite stories happens in Tennessee, and favorite because it's so peculiar. There are missionaries in Tennessee who get surrounded by a mob, not because they're Mormon, but because the pamphlet they're distributing is anti-slavery. And it is illegal in Tennessee to publish and distribute anti-slavery literature. The mobbers don't care about their religion, but they care about protecting and preserving slavery. And then this is fascinating for those that know kind of how things break down in secession of southern states in the Civil War. In Kentucky, there was no persecution because of the anti-slavery, which may kind of portend what happens in the Civil War, where Tennessee secedes and Kentucky does not. So, this is all going on in the spring and summer of 1844. There's talk of electors. Every state, they pick electors. There's invitations for people to serve as Joseph Smith's vice presidential running mate. And they ultimately secure that. And this all begs the question, and anytime I write about or speak about Joseph Smith's presidential campaign, this question is always invoked. Was he serious? Was this a serious campaign? My answer is yes, but here's the asterisk next to it. Just because Joseph Smith thought that he could win did not mean that he believed that he would win. Joseph Smith's approach seemed to be, I'm going to do whatever I can to protect the rights of my people. And this is often the case of religious minorities in the United States then and now. You throw whatever legal challenges, whatever political possibilities against the wall that you can, and you see what sticks. And so even as Joseph Smith's running for president, he's not putting all his eggs in this basket. And their big obstacle, Joseph Smith has seen his biggest political obstacle is the states' rights doctrines. How do we get around them? So he runs for president, but at the same time, the Mormons petition Congress to make Joseph Smith a general in the United States Army. He was lieutenant general of his community militia. And they petitioned Congress to let him raise up a 100,000-man volunteer army to protect Americans traveling west to Oregon. The catch is that Joseph Smith could then lead that army to protect the Latter-day Saints if mobs came against them, a way of getting around states' rights. It went nowhere in Congress, dead on arrival. At the same time, they petitioned Congress, and this one's fascinating, to make Nauvoo a federal city like Washington, D.C. Essentially to have Nauvoo secede from Illinois, not from the country, but from Illinois, because then they would be protected by the federal government. States' rights, they've gotten around it. Another petition at this exact same time was for the Latter-day Saints to be granted a liberal tract of land in the Western Territories, where they could live in isolation, they could live in peace, but that they could also be protected by the federal government should mobs come upon them. That goes nowhere. And then the last one, this one's not as well known, and we don't know as much about it as we wish we did. The Mormons consider leaving the United States altogether. They consider going to Texas. And they enter secret negotiations with Sam Houston, when this is still the Republic of Texas, about occupying the Nueces Strip. And so those of you that know your Texas history, right, there's this disputed border between Texas and Mexico of whether the border is the Nueces River or the Rio Grande. And often in border disputes, the difference maker is boots on the ground. And so if you can get people to settle the area, you're more likely to win that border dispute. And if they come with their own militia, even better. So that's why Sam Houston's interested in the Mormons, and the Mormons are interested in Sam Houston because this may solve their problems. That fizzles out. But does that, I hope that helps contextualize this campaign. It's part of this larger attempt to get around the states' rights doctrines that are enabling religious inequality in the United States. And Joseph Smith is not the only one to point this out. You have the Shakers in New York who similarly point out the problem of states' rights. Now, the Shakers are pacifist, and they live communally. They hold all their property in common. And New York at this time has a law that every man adult male needs to serve in the militia, and if you don't, you pay a $4 fine. Well, the Shakers are pacifists, so they decline to serve, and since all their property is held in common, They argue that the fine imposed upon their community represents a tax against a religious group for their belief. And New York won't budge. They're seeking a way around states' rights. They're not getting it. And in another case, and this is shortly after Joseph Smith's eventual assassination, is Father Bernard Promoli, a Catholic priest in New Orleans, during an epidemic, is limited on how they can hold their funerals. They're not allowed to have open casket funerals. This goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And he's told that the federal government can't enforce the First Amendment on individual states. But there's something striking about this. Joseph Smith, he was smart, but he was not a constitutional scholar. He was not a great legal expert. Neither were the Shakers, neither was Father Bernard Promoli. But the three most visible examples on the vanguard of those calling for the Bill of Rights to apply to the individual states are not constitutional scholars. They're the leaders of marginalized religious groups whose lived experience led them to say, we love our country, but there's something wrong with the Constitution if we can be treated this way in our country. We need to fix it. And again, that would happen eventually. But I think there's something striking that it's these leaders of religious minority groups, not constitutional scholars, who are some of the first to make this case. So as you may have guessed, both by the subtitle of my book and the fact that Joseph Smith was not the next president, he didn't win. And it is quite tragic. He doesn't even make it to Election Day. He is assassinated on, June 27th, 1844. And it's a distinction that nobody aspires to. The first assassinated presidential candidate in American history. Now, the asterisk next to it is he was not assassinated because he was running for president. He was not killed to stop him from becoming president. Local political tensions, those same ones we described in 1843, boil over. After, in his capacity as mayor and with the city council's approval in June 1844, orders the destruction of an anti-Mormon newspaper that rises up in his own city. They feel they have good legal standing to do so. It's been debated by legal historians ever since. People are determined that this is our chance to kill Joseph Smith and expel the Mormons. Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram are imprisoned in the jail in Carthage, Illinois. The guards are not numerous enough to protect them, and a mob with their faces painted black storms the jail and kills these two religious leaders. And in the ensuing months, the Mormons are indeed pushed out of Illinois, and they leave the United States believing that the country had failed them. When asked if he would ever return, Brigham Young said, I won't even summer in, quote, I won't even summer in that hell of a hole. The irony of ironies is by the time they arrive in the Great Salt Lake Valley, the Mexican-American War has started, and they thought they had left the United States, and by the time they're settled, the Utah Territory is part of the United States. And so that's the tragic story of Joseph Smith's presidential campaign. And in concluding, I want to ask the question, was Joseph Smith right when he said that the states' rights doctrines are what feed mobs? And I think to an extent he was. And let me give you a stunning example from the 1850s. Now, you recall the Mormon-Missouri War in 1838. One of the militiamen who had helped expel the Mormons under threat of state-sanctioned extermination was, in the 1850s, a sitting U.S. senator from Missouri. And in 1854, Missouri was dealing with another, quote-unquote, unwanted political minority, the abolitionist. At the same time that abolitionists were beginning to pour into Kansas and Nebraska to help determine whether those would be slave states or free states, they were also pouring into Missouri, which was a slave state. And there was great concern about what would happen with the abolitionists. And the political leaders of the state were saying, how do we get rid of them? Well, in 1854, Senator David Atchison writes to Jefferson Davis, Secretary of War, yes, that Jefferson Davis, and this is what he says, quote, "We are organizing to meet their organization. We will be compelled to shoot, burn, and hang, but the thing will soon be over. We intend to Mormonize the abolitionist." And Mormonize, they turned Mormon into a verb for using extra-legal mob violence to drive out unwanted political minorities. Was Joseph Smith right? Well, Missouri had used extra-legal mob violence to put down dissent, to put down and expel unwanted political minorities, and they had gotten away with it because of states' rights. 1854, they're faced with another group, and what do? They go back to that playbook, and they do it again, and now they have a word for this extra-legal violence, and it is Mormonize. It's a striking statement from a sitting U.S. Senator condoning mob violence to ensure your political voice wins the day. Now, the flip side of that is the Mormons get to Utah territory, they're no longer in a state. Was states' rights the only thing enabling bigotry and prejudice? And the answer is no. If you ever want to hear of like a long-standing fight with the federal government, look up Brigham Young's history with the different presidents of the United States. Things don't get easier for the Mormons in Utah once they are beyond the states' rights issue. So I think Joseph Smith was right. The states' rights doctrines feed mobs, but it's also important to note that it wasn't states' rights alone that was facilitating prejudice and bigotry. So, when we talk about, sorry, no one's ever accused me of being too quiet, so I guess, case in point there. So when we talk about the political obstacles to universal religious freedom in 19th century America, and in the present, we are not merely talking about a list of overtly discriminatory laws or public policies or philosophies of governance. We are talking about the way Americans use seemingly neutral policies. There's nothing inherently discriminatory about religion in the states' rights doctrine. We're talking about the way that Americans use seemingly neutral policies to enact and maintain discrimination against minority groups. Some do so out of ignorance. They're unaware of the way their political devotion is abridging the rights of some of their fellow citizens. Sometimes we support policies that may not seem discriminatory on the surface. We agree with them, and we're just unaware of the impact they have when they are enacted. Some may do so to defend inaction as a convenient way of claiming that their hands are tied, that they can do nothing. Still others may use these laws as a thin veil covering their prejudice against one religious minority group or another. Joseph Smith ran for president because he recognized this problem. He fought religious bigotry, but he knew that the fight was against more than religious bigots. The fight was also against the systems of governance that empowered and ultimately protected such bigotry. Through his candidacy, Smith promoted the idea that as important as rooting out prejudice and misunderstanding were to his cause, Americans would never experience true universal religious freedom until they could also address the flaws in their laws and government that maintained such inequality. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Spencer. That was terrific. So we are going to have two of our postdoctoral fellows are going to have microphones, one on either side. We would love to open this up to Q&A. All we ask is that if you want to ask a question, raise your hand and wait for a microphone to be passed to you so that we can all hear you. Looks like we've got one right here. I'll let Spencer kind of run his own Q&A, and I'll just stand over here as backup.
That was great. To be clear, none of the state constitutions had any form of a Bill of Rights.
Most of them did. Missouri, in its constitution, actually declared religious freedom. It just ignored that.
Okay. So,
But the problem is, when they ignore it, the federal government has no power to come in, right? So Joseph Smith wasn't trying to abolish states' rights. He wasn't trying to abolish divided sovereignty of our country. But he had to level it, even it out, so the federal government could intervene when a state declined to do so.
and exactly where, after the given the 14th Amendment and everything, does that trump any of this stuff that's going on in the states?
Yes, and so, oh man, I wish I had the Constitution with me. I can't remember the exact word in the clause, but essentially what the 14th Amendment does in giving birthright citizenship, right, and that the laws of the nation can be enforced in any state if someone moves from one state to another. Am I mangling that? I think that's the basic. Yeah, and it's tied to slavery. It's tied to slavery. That's the 14th Amendment. And this is the fascinating thing. It eventually does apply to religion, but the Supreme Court doesn't consistently enforce the freedom of religion clause on individual states until the 1920s. And anyone who wants to know more about that, David Seahat has written a great book on that called The Myth of American Religious Freedom. And if I mangled my interpretation of the 14th Amendment right there, someone correct me. Does that answer your question? Awesome.
I was going to ask something kind of similar. I was going to ask, since you talked about the 14th Amendment being nearly 20 years after the assassination of Joseph Smith, if anybody had specifically sort of cited him as an example for why specifically religious freedom should be incorporated by the Supreme Court. It sounds like it took a lot longer than that to actually be codified, but do you know of anybody that was, say, not a Mormon, that was specifically talking about this assassination as an example for why things need to change?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer speaks to this point, right? Joseph Smith, the Shakers, the Catholics were on the vanguard of calling for this constitutional reform, at least this type, something that would enable the federal government to help. They were on the vanguard, but that movement does not lead to the change, right? It's anti-slavery that leads to the change. And so there is no direct line from the activism of Joseph Smith and others to the 14th Amendment. And if you want some of the inside story, subtitles are funny things. And the press often wants the catchiest subtitle to the book that's going to sell. And sometimes, and the historian wants to make sure you want your book to sell, but you also want it to be accurate. And we probably went through a dozen different subtitles. Anyone from Oxford who's watching this on the internet, I love you. At one point, the subtitle was something that, about like ushering in American religious freedom, or, that changed religious freedom. And in that sense, Joseph Smith's story is not one of success in terms of religious freedom. His campaign in no way brings about greater religious freedom. And so we went back and forth to make sure that the subtitle was catchy, hopefully promoted the book, but didn't state something that wasn't factually true. But I think it's useful not because of what it brought about. Even in its failure, it illuminates political obstacles, because we've long talked about states' rights as being, some people really believe in that system of governance, but many others used it disingenuously as a way of preserving race-based slavery. And I'm not discounting that. I'm just saying that's not the only type of inequality that the states' rights doctrines upheld. And so, Joseph Smith's campaign does more to illuminate the systemic nature of the problem than his campaign ever did to bring about the solution. So, I'm glad you asked that question.
Yes, in the process of your research or writing the book, did you have any insights into why there seems to be a thread throughout American history of a fear of minority groups, especially fear of minority groups that have religion attached to it?
Yeah, it's a big question, and many brilliant scholars have written extensively on it. Let me give you kind of the Cliff Note version of it. Religious freedom as we understand it today is really kind of coming out of an imperial context. It's made by Protestants for Protestants to allow Protestant dissenter groups, Methodists, Baptists, and others to practice with toleration in a state that has a state church. It really begins to test that idea when you get groups that are not Protestant or not mainline enough. And specifically with Mormons and Catholics, the argument is very similar. So John Locke wrote his letter concerning religious toleration, and one of the groups he leaves out are Catholics because he believes that their loyalty to the Pope is akin to loyalty to a foreign prince. And that's a danger to democracy. Or he wouldn't have said democracy, but danger to the sovereignty and continuance of the state. And you see that in the United States as well. Catholics are feared for much the same reason. Al Smith runs for president in the 1920s. His Catholicism is a major strike against him. 1960, John F. Kennedy has to convince the country in a very eloquent speech that if he's elected, he's not going to take his marching orders from the Pope, right? There's this fear of outside forces pulling the strings of American democracy. And with the Latter-day Saints, especially later on, it's the same thing. When Mitt Romney runs for president, I want to say this was the 2012 race, that he has to make a very similar speech, very similar to what Kennedy had said, that he's not going to take his marching orders from the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who Latter-day Saints revere as a prophet, more than just an ecclesiastical leader. They believe he is a prophet akin to Moses or Abraham. And so I think that's a big part of it. The religious freedom as we conceived of it early on was very much by Protestants for Protestants, and there were groups such as the Mormons and the Catholics who really challenged the boundaries of that. And in many cases, not all cases, but many, there was a fear that allegiance to people potentially outside of the state could jeopardize the continuance of the state. Great question. Did I answer it? Okay, good. That makes me feel even better.
That was wonderful. I'd like to delve back into the actual operation of the campaign. And in fact, if you wouldn't mind going back to the slide that showed his pamphlet, I have a two-part question, I guess. The first is, and this may be explained by a deeper knowledge of the hierarchy of the Mormon church at this time, the missionaries that were sent out, who had previously been sent out to missionize for God, were now being told to missionize for someone less than God.
Yes.
Was there any pushback on that? But let me ask the second one, because I think it's related. How did Smith frame his religious standing in his campaign? I mean, did he make a point of saying, I'm a religious leader who is coming to run for this presidency? I have a particular affiliation with God, and I'm running for the presidency. God told me to run for the presidency. How much did his religion actually fit into what he was trying to argue and how he set up his campaign?
Yeah. No, fantastic questions. First part, there was no pushback, and I think most of the missionaries understood that they believed that, again, that this is primitive Christianity. So in preserving the church and their rights, you are preserving Christianity, primitive Christianity. And if that meant ensuring the election of your prophet as president, or any of these other ways they were trying to get around states' rights, they were okay with that. Although there were some that weren't comfortable preaching politics, right? They didn't feel like they were really capable of speaking eloquently on political matters. And for them, they tended to just go back to preaching religion because a convert was also a vote. And so many just felt comfortable doing that. Joseph Smith, though, downplayed, or in the pamphlet doesn't even talk about his prophetic role. In fact, when he met with Van Buren asked, what separates you from the other churches? And he said something very succinct, like our mode of baptism and the laying on of hands for the gift of the Holy Ghost. All other differences are swallowed up in the Holy Ghost. And it's like, well, no, I mean, that's one way of putting it. There's a lot more there, but you get it in that letter home to Nauvoo. Essentially, we are trying to play up our commonalities. And so in the public relations field, they realize the more we can show people that we are Christians just like the Protestants are, they will be less likely to persecute us. And to an extent it works. In Washington, D.C., Joseph Smith gives a speech, and there's a man named Matthew Livingston Davis. He was Aaron Burr's biographer, had been a member of Congress. He was a correspondent for a London newspaper. And he writes home to his wife saying, he's changed my mind about the Mormons. And he says, now I don't care for any religion, but I now see them as being a mistreated person. So from a PR perspective, it was better to emphasize commonalities, common beliefs, rather than to emphasize differences. And although there's one time I know that he invokes being a prophet, and it was in jest. In May 1844, just a month before he's assassinated, Charles Francis Adams, not yet vice president, and Josiah Quincy, who's, a few years later is going to be the mayor of Boston. His dad was president of Harvard. They're on this grand tour of the West, and their steamship has mechanical problems, and it stops in Nauvoo. And they spend an entire day with Joseph Smith, hearing him preach, talking politics, and they're on a carriage ride, and Josiah Quincy wrote this down. He says, and Joseph Smith in jest says, they say, well, you're a prophet, who's going to win? So I can tell you who's not going to win. The incumbent John Tyler, who had been expelled from his own party. So it was kind of a jest saying, like, everyone knew John Tyler wasn't going to win. But yeah, generally speaking, he downplayed the religious differences and didn't invoke his prophet. But it concerned many people. Many newspapers ignored his campaign, and they weren't taking his campaign seriously, but they put out a cry of, what if someone who could win, a religious leader, runs for president? That is dangerous, right? So it invoked this fear of someone like Smith, who actually could have won, eventually running. Does that make sense?
So can you speak a little bit to how the Supreme Court or how the federal government, in areas that they controlled, what their opinion of religious freedom and how that would work in those areas, even in this time? Certainly because, in 1878 in Reynolds v. U.S., it seems to hinge on Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists about what he means by exercising religion versus opinion, action versus opinion. Was there a general idea during this time of how they would handle that in federal territories, or was it just not even something that was on their radar and worth worrying about in those areas?
Yeah, I'm struggling to think of any major cases in the territories. And I'm failing to come up with many. In terms of white American settlers, many of these were still very sparsely populated. But I think as a general rule, they were viewing it as, the whole idea, Congress shall make no laws respecting religion, that they weren't going to promote any one religion or obstruct another religion, generally speaking. There may be some cases that run contrary to that, but I think they were pretty sincere in keeping that their effort. But I'm failing to come up with any concrete examples in the kind of this antebellum period of issues that weren't in the states. And there were Mormons in Iowa, across the river from Illinois, and it was Iowa territory at the time. And at no point did they consider just moving their whole population to Iowa. And to this day, I'm still not sure why. So it's a good question. And this is, the academic way of saying, I don't know. Instead of just saying, I don't know, you say a few things you do know that might inform a potential answer. So very good question.
Okay, I'd like to ask one more, maybe, in closing. What happened after his assassination in terms of the election? Like, did it get national coverage? Did the other candidates comment on it? Or was it just forgotten?
You know, that's a good question, and I think a good way of closing, because when news gets back, it starts spreading, and it takes a while for news to spread at this time. So from Nauvoo to Springfield, Illinois, just a couple weeks later, they're having these parties on the 4th of July celebrating American rights and freedom, and the Whig newspaper in Springfield gets word, and they can't believe it. They can't believe that the Mormon prophet would have been assassinated. And in that same issue of the paper, there's also expressed disbelief about what's known as the Philadelphia Bible riots, in which mobs had burned the homes of Catholic immigrants in Philadelphia. And so you're getting news of religious persecution from near and far, and there's this disbelief that as we're celebrating our freedom and our, exceptional level of freedom, as they would say, there are groups being persecuted. And so there was a lot of, even if people didn't like or agree with Joseph Smith, there was a lot of lamenting that such a thing had happened. There was some, Alexander Campbell is maybe an example of the extreme. He was very clear in saying this wasn't, he lamented that someone was murdered, but he was very clear in saying, in his view, this wasn't religious persecution because Mormonism's not a real religion in his view. And that's often what happens, right? If a group is too far removed from the Protestant mainstream at this time, you don't call it religious persecution or an abridgment of religious freedoms because you're not justifying their religion as genuine. And so Alexander Campbell has this really scathing kind of, the type of thing that if someone was on Twitter today and said something like that at an event, they'd be, a firestorm. The Mormons ultimately vote for James K. Polk, the eventual winner, which baffles me a little bit, because I think as a party, the Whigs probably would have done more to protect them, but I think there was such an aversion to Henry Clay's answer that they couldn't bring themselves to vote for Henry Clay. But that's just my best guess, because the Whigs as a party were better positioned to help the Mormons than the Democrats. But I think it was an aversion to Henry Clay that kept them from doing it. And within 2 years of the election, the Mormons are loading wagons, getting ready to head west.
All right, well, I'd like everyone to join me again in thanking Dr. McBride for this tonight. It's great. Yeah, it's just terrific, a great way to start off the year. There are books for sale right outside. We're going to ask Spencer to sit up here, so if you'd like to come have a chat and have your book signed, please feel free to come back in and do that. And secondly, all information about what we've got coming up in terms of events, both digital and in person, are all on our website, smu.edu/cph. You can find everything you need there. Thank you for being here tonight. It's a real treat to be able to see everyone after so long, and we look forward to seeing you again. Have a good night.